Hello, everybody, and welcome on into the Week 1 Fantasy Football Recap. Today, we will be discussing some injuries to players, backfield situations, players who did better than expected, players who underperformed, and players who surprised us, whether that be in a good or bad way. Let's start off with an injury update and a look at some messy backfields. Running back Raheem Mostert will be sidelined for 8 weeks because of a chipped cartilage in his knee. Look to add Elijah Mitchell off of waivers and keep an eye on Trey Sermon's name. He was a healthy scratch in the 49ers game against the Lions. Washington's quarterback Ryan Fitzpatrick is expected to miss 6 to 8 weeks because of a hip injury that he suffered on Sunday. Taylor Heinicke will take over the reins as QB1. Jerry Jeudy suffered a high ankle sprain in Denver's win against the Giants and is expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks. Courtland Sutton and Noah Fant's value should go up, but look out for Tim Patrick as a waiver wire add. Mark Ingram played the most snaps out of the rest of the options in that messy Texans backfield at 46%, going for 85 yards and a touchdown on 26 rushes. David Johnson played the second most amount of snaps at 28%, and Phillip Lindsay finished right behind him with 26% of the snaps. Speaking of messy backfields, the Jets' backfield didn't go as anyone expected. Ty Johnson played 54% of the snaps, with Tevin Coleman playing 26%. Michael Carter was right behind Tevin Coleman, playing 25% of the snaps. Michael Carter owners are going to have patience until we get more answers on this mess of a backfield. 3 players who outperformed their projections this week were Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper had 13 receptions for 139 yards and found the end zone twice through 16 targets, good for 38.9 fantasy points in a PPR format. With Gallup sidelined for 3 to 5 weeks, both Amari and CeeDee should get enough volume for them to both be fantasy relevant for the coming weeks. Rob Gronkowski. Staying with the Thursday night game, Brady and Gronk looked like vintage Brady and Gronk. Gronk had 8 targets, catching them all for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns, finishing with 29 PPR points. Tampa is always a confusing offense to predict with all of that talent that they have, but a matchup against an Atlanta defense that just got torched by Jalen Hurts means Gronk should see your lineups, but with tampered expectations. Deebo Samuel. We'll wrap the overperformers up in Detroit, where Deebo Samuel absolutely lit up the Lions defense, going for 189 yards on 9 receptions and a touchdown, finishing with 31.9 fantasy points. Brandon Ayuk didn't play in this game, leading to Deebo getting plenty of targets, 12 to be exact. With Ayuk's status up in the air and Kyle Shanahan's creative mind, Deebo should be in line for a mid-wide receiver 2 game against Philly. 3 players who underperformed this week were Green Bay's Arians. They both deserve one spot because of how abysmal they were. Rodgers had one of the worst games of his career in the Packers' 38-3 loss to the Saints, going 15 of 28 with 133 yards, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and finishing with 1.32 fantasy points. Jordan Love came into this game to play quarterback, so that tells you everything you needed to know about this game and Rodgers' performance. Aaron Jones didn't have a much better day at the office either, rushing the ball 5 times for a total of 9 yards and catching 2 passes for 13 yards to finish with 4.2 fantasy points. Not at all what fantasy managers thought they would get from both these Green Bay studs when they drafted them. Mike Gesicki. Heading east to Foxborough, we have the Dolphins tight end. Gesicki fantasy managers could have started Shannon Sharpe this week and gotten the same result out of it. Gesicki had 0 fantasy points and only 2 targets. It gets even worse for Gesicki managers, as he only played 39% of the snaps. The good news is that he ran 50% of his snaps in the slot and 45% of them out wide, but with Will Fuller coming back, those numbers may drop down back to earth, and we may be seeing fantasy managers dropping Gesicki and looking for another tight end on the waiver wire. Brandon Ayuk. We head back out to Detroit to find the final player who underperformed, none other than Deebo Samuel's teammate Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk was a ghost in the box score during Sunday's shootout win against Detroit and left fantasy managers confused. Kyle Shanahan said that Ayuk's lack of performance was out of caution because of a hamstring injury he was nursing during the preseason, so it's only a matter of time until we get the Brandon Ayuk we're accustomed to seeing. The question is, how long will we have to wait to see him? A couple of surprises from Week 1 were Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston threw for 5 touchdowns but only 148 yards, finishing with 29.62 fantasy points. If I told you that one quarterback in this game would throw for 5 touchdowns and said that Winston would outplay Aaron Rodgers, you would have thought I was delusional, but that's exactly what happened. With New Orleans traveling out to Carolina next week, Winston is a solid streaming option if you were to go that route. Mike Williams. Moving out to Washington for our second surprise, we'd find Chargers wide receiver Mike Williams. Only getting one less target than Keenan Allen, Mike Williams caught 8 balls for 82 yards and 1 touchdown, good for 22.2 fantasy points. With the Chargers hosting the Cowboys next week, Williams could be a flex play, especially seeing how the Tampa Bay wide receivers did against that Dallas defense. Mike Evans. Speaking of Tampa wide receivers, our last surprise comes from Tampa. Mike Evans was a surprise this week, but in the worst way possible. He disappointed fantasy managers, catching 3 out of his 6 targets for 24 yards and no touchdowns, good for only 5.4 fantasy points. Based off last year alone, you drafted Evans knowing that he was going to be touchdown dependent, but it makes it even worse when he's dropping the passes that come his way. I'm sure Mike Evans fantasy owners didn't expect 5.4 fantasy points when they plugged him into their starting lineup, especially when he played what was one of the worst secondaries in the NFL last year, and it probably made it sting even more when every other Buccaneers pass catcher had a great night. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and so you can stay up to date for more weekly fantasy recaps coming out every Tuesday.